thing and put on pause. Okay. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 today. We have seen a gradual turn, and now we see a full turn from the negativism that Solomon had in the first several chapters of the first 5 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. We see there's nothing new under the sun, and he kept mentioning that, and he got to the point where he said, I hated life. We saw that in chapter 2, verse 17. And we see that the frustrations of life, the emptiness of life without the Lord. And gradually he comes around to now he's starting to add more of his thoughts about God in his life. In chapter 6, we saw that he started giving us instruction rather than just complaining about life and how bad it was and nothing new under the sun and vanity of vanities and emptiness, and I've tried everything and nothing brings satisfaction. Then in chapter 6, we see that he started talking about false religion or false worship. He says, if you're going to worship the Lord, make him real in your life. And then he talked about the dangers of prosperity. A lot of times, I would say, and I've seen this in my ministry, people get right with the Lord, they start worshiping the Lord, and they get off of their drugs or get off of whatever lifestyle they're on, and that's not always the case. But and they start putting God first, and all of a sudden God starts blessing them. And then when God blesses them, then all of a sudden the things of the world become more important than the things of God. And all of a sudden now they're too busy for God. And so Solomon is saying, be careful of that. Be careful of the vanity of worship, the vainness of just thinking that gain is godliness. And now in chapter 7, he starts giving us just a whole flurry of Proverbs. He's back to his Proverbs days, which would have been earlier in his life. And he's spent a lot of time outside the will of God. And the one thing about, as we saw back in chapter 3, once time is used, once your time is up, you don't get it back. And so what we do with our day today, whether we make it to count for the Lord or not, we'll never have another chance for today. And day goes by so slowly, but at the same time it goes by swiftly. And we see that people get up to in their age or whatever, and they say, where did time go? And look what I missed or what I didn't do. Especially I see that with parents. I should have done this. I should have done that. And of course we all do that as far as a parent. I know that my children, I could go back and say, I wish I'd have done so many things differently. And so we can put ourselves on a guilt trip, but all I can say is that I tried to serve the Lord, and I hope my children will do the same. And so, but we can't dwell on the past. And so in chapter 7, Solomon is now giving us some and I titled this, Good Advice from a Vain Old Man. He wasted the center part of his life in all of the things that God told him specifically not to do. He was told not to multiply wives, and he had 1,000. He was told not to multiply horses, and he was a very, very famous horse trader. And then he was told not to gather or put his heart in gold, and he was one of the richest, probably the richest man that ever walked the face of the earth. And he was known for his gold mines. They have uncovered extensive stables of horses that he had. And of course we know about and that's one of the most famous things, is his 1,000 wives, 700 wives and 300 concubines. And then we know that he was a very intelligent man. He was a botanist, or he loved botany. He loved zoology. He loves philosophy. I mean, the guy just had multiple talents and multiple pursuits. Very brilliant man. But he found out that mental acumen does not bring moral excellence. And that's the problem that we see today. A lot of people are smart, and we see them in our universities and so forth, and they're considered our intelligentsia or whatever, but they're some of the dumbest people on earth when it comes to common sense. And so we see that that Solomon is now giving us some advice that he's learned along the way. It's more things that I've learned. I've read several biographies or books from people who have titled their books Things I've Learned, and especially preachers. And the frustration I get from them is they want to tell you all the good things they learned, but they don't want to tell you how they overcame some of their faults or some of their failures. They kind of leave those out. Well, Solomon is, like Lincoln said. He said, whenever you paint me, and whenever you tell a portrait or anybody painting him, you say, include warts and all. He wants warts and everything. So, make me a real man. And so, by all accounts, Lincoln was not a good-looking guy. He would not have been. He had a face made for radio, as someone would say. But at the same time, of course, because of what we think of him as his character and everything, we look at him as a very beautiful man, a very handsome man. And so he begins this in chapter 7. Now he's going to give you things to consider, and he's going to give you rapid fire some examples or some things to consider. Then in verses 7 through 22, he's going to give you a perspective on everything he learned in his days of vanity, and that'll begin in verse 15. And then we see also he starts his reflections from those experiences in verse 23 and through the first verse of chapter 8. And so we see, first of all, the things to consider. And he begins right off the bat, a good name. A good name is better than precious ointment. Now, that's the one thing you could leave your kids is a good name, a good reputation. You can't leave them, you can leave them things that you're out of control of, but the one thing you can control is your good name. Now, what they do with it is up to them, but that's the one thing that will last. Whereas if you give them all the ointments and everything in the world, they might make a little money off of it, but what happens with perfume? It dissipates, doesn't it? So he says it's a whole lot better to have a good name than expensive perfume. And you can make yourself smell good, look good, or whatever, but all those things decay. But the one thing that's going to last is your good name. And the one thing you're going to see recurring, he keeps talking about death now. He's up older now. He's probably in his late 60s. He died at 70. And so, and he's looked at his life and he's seen so many things that have gone wrong. But he says, on the day of death, then the day of one's birth. And in other words, people are going to know more about you and think more about you and remember you more after you die than when you were born. I mean, we got pictures of our children, and if we didn't mark them, some of them we can't tell who was who. Isn't it interesting how that is? And really, it's hard for me as a father now, and my children have children, to remember and put myself back in the days when they were small. It's because that's not them. I still remember them, but that's not them anymore. And so now you can say, yeah, I remember that kid. He's still like he was, and whatever. Well, you know that. There are character traits and so forth. But at the same time, what you do with what you learn. And like I'm dealing with a man that I'm saying you can't really keep blaming your parents. I mean, sooner or later, you got to be, okay, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And you got to go with what it is. And all of us have things that we've had to overcome. And unfortunately, as you get older, your kids start telling you about all the things you did wrong or whatever. And you start learning, hey, I didn't realize that was whatever. Or they think they're so much better. And we just sit back and say, okay, you'll learn or whatever. But they have their mind of their own, and they're not complainers. But but you do feel like that at times with your kids. And so there are things to consider. I mean, your good name is really the only thing that you can give to your kids. That's going to last. And I praise the Lord that my kids, like I told my only two granddaughters, six grandsons, and two granddaughters. And I tell my granddaughters, all Lashley girls are good looking. So, so I try to build them up and so forth. But, and of course, leave them that name too. Of course, they're going to change their name, so that doesn't really help that much, but at least they understand that there's a pride in the family or whatever. So he says, consider that. Now, we can't spend time on every verse like that, but notice in verses 2 through 10, he's going to talk about common sense. We've heard a lot about that recently. What's common sense? Just facing the facts as they are and dealing with them. I mean, you can't change science and you can't change nature. And, there's just certain things that if you act foolishly, you're going to be a fool. I think, and I still think of a grandmother in our church, Mother Mac, loved her to pieces. She was so dear to my wife and I and our early marriage and so forth. But her girls would come back. Her one daughter was married to a Marine Corps pilot, and another was married to a businessman up in North Alabama. But they would always laugh and say, Mother would always tell us, girls, I trust you, I just don't trust nature. and so she would tell, and they would laugh about it, but she made sure they were in at a certain time, and those girls were very prosperous girls with good families growing up. But she didn't trust nature. Well, kids are going to be kids, yes, but kids have a nature. And so we've got to put some guidelines in there and so forth. So it's just common sense. But he said, and here he begins again with tragedy. Verses 2 through 4, he says, a man whom God has given riches, that's verse 6, chapter 6. Chapter 7 says, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. And then he goes on, he says, sorrow is better than laughter. For a sad countenance, the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. What a negative thought. But you think about it. I mean, really, don't you learn more in the struggles and in the heartaches than you learn in the comedy hours? People are spending all kinds of money. They have all kinds of shows on internet and everything else now. Comedy, people are trying to get into it, and it gets grosser and grosser. When people run out of material, that's what usually happens. But they're trying to have, some identity with others and kind of laugh about life. And yet, I've learned a lot more in my sorrows. One of the things I've talked about, my mother passed away when I was 21. Just turned 21, I was in the service. But that experience gave me so much and has given me so much empathy and understanding in the ministry of people who are going through sorrow. I mean, things that I've had people say, Pastor, it just seems like you understand. And I would not have if I had not learned just watching my mother waste away. And the bad thing about it, I had to come home from the service, and so I watched her in steps. I wasn't with her every day. So when you're with someone every day, you just get used to it. But every time I came home, it was like a new funeral. I mean, I just wanted to go out and cry, seeing my mother go downhill and eventually die. But boy, did that teach me so much. I mean, I don't want to ever go through that again. But I sure learned a lot. And it sure sobered me up in a lot of areas of life. Because as he says here, the house of mourning rather than feasting, I could have gone through the service and just hit every bar in town and had the greatest time, a girl in every port and all those kind of things you hear. But the guys that I saw do that, well, I don't want to get into too many stories, but they would come back to the ship and they had to go back home. And I remember one guy that he did that. And how do you tell your wife that you might have picked up something in the last port? And things like that. And he's sitting on the back of the fantail wondering what he's going to do. Well, Ashley, and all this stuff. Well, they laughed at me for not going with them into those places, but I'm sure glad that I didn't. And so there again is, but does that make me a fantastic? No, I had my problems, and I'm a sinner, and that's why he's going to say later on, all of us are sinners. He's going to say that right in the middle of chapter 7. So no, I wasn't the perfect little guy. In fact, some of the books I read, some of the things I read in the service. One time I was reading about this good Christian and how that he was witnessing to all the guys. And they picked up, he was praying beside his bed. And he's going to talk about this even here, about don't be overly pious. But the guy would make a big show of praying beside his bed. And then somebody threw shoes at him. Well, he polished the shoes and had them ready for the guy the next morning. Folks, I wasn't like that. If somebody threw shoes at me, I'd probably pick them up and throw them back at them. Or either try to stuff it down their throat sideways or what. That was me. I'm sorry. I was not the perfect Christian with a halo over my head. In fact, I did have a section leader. He said, Lashley, straighten up your halo. It's crooked. So you get laughed at and all those different things. But boy, you learn so much about life and about people during the hard times. And it really toughens you up, or it makes you a whole lot wiser and more empathetic. It softens you up in one way and toughens you up in another. But he says the house of mourning, the house of tragedy. People go to a comedy show or to a play that's all laughter and they don't remember it, but they're deeply moved by something that really hits home. And there's a tragedy. And so he says sorrow is better than laughter. And the heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning. You learn a lot about life because of death, don't we, unfortunately? And that's one of the common facts of life. Then in verses 5 through 6, he says about a rebuke. He says it's better to be rebuked by a wise man. And there again, I go back to my service days. And the last of my, my mother had died, and I only had a few more months and weeks, and I was out of the service. And back then, I don't know if they still do it, but they gave quarterly marks. And every quarter you would get what the chief petty officer and the officer thought of you. And we always called it a 4.0 sailor. If you were 4.0, then you were kind of like 4.0 grade. But he gave me, and the last quarterly marks I got, I'm still embarrassed. I think they're on my permanent record. But he gave me low quarterly marks on every area. And the thing that really made me mad is we had the slob that was in our, he didn't take, one of those guys you have to remind to take a shower, or we're going to help him with it or whatever. And he was just always sloppy. And he gave me lower quarterly marks on appearance than that guy. Boy, that made me mad, because that was one thing I was a slob. And I went to him and talked to him. I talked to good old Chief Moreland. And old Chief Moreland said, Lashley, you have been one of the best workers, whatever, And he says, you just developed a short-timer's attitude like so many guys do. You got to remember, guy, you're going to be a preacher one day, and son, you better learn to finish strong. And I sat there like, hear this, as far as I know, he wasn't even saved. Telling me that, and man, that hit me like a sledgehammer. And you know what? Today, I want to finish strong. I mean, here I'm in my 70s, and I'm going to say, I'm going to finish strong. I'm going to be, the end of my ministry is going to be stronger than the first. Because, boy, that open rebuke just cut me to pieces. But yet, it was exactly what I needed. And isn't that true in life? And there again, you can see how that I have applied myself to these, and you can go to these passages. And what I want to do, my goal, is to give you some thought structure so that you can go back, and if there's some of these verses are very difficult until you start realizing what he's saying and the experiences that he's had. I imagine a lot of people came by and said, Solomon, you got enough wives, you don't need any more. And that just made him mad, and he got more. And now he's looking back, and in fact, he's going to say something about that later on. And so verses 5 and 6. Then in verse 7, he says, surely oppression destroys a man's reason, and bribe debases his heart. And here, character, with oppression, what happens when you're squeezed? What comes out? What comes out when you squeeze a rose? What comes out? Good nectar and smell. If you squeeze a lemon, what comes out? You know, there again, somebody about leg lemons, but you understand what we're saying. Verse 8 through 9, he's saying, notice again, he's saying the idea of character. The end of a thing is better than the beginning. The patient, I like what Stephen Covey said there, one of the 7 traits of successful people is begin with the end in mind. What do you want to do in your life? I like to tell people, what do you want in 5 years? In 10 years? Where do you want to be? What do you want to have accomplished in your life in the next couple of years? He said, the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. There again, the idea of ego-centered, compulsion type of driven person. Do not hasten when your spirit is angry. So it's both the compulsion and anger. For anger is in the bosom of fools. And that has so been true in my life. The Lord gave me a verse very early in life. The wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. And I could think of 3 specific instances in my adult life that I lost it. I mean, I just got mad and I just went ahead and said what was on my mind. Oh, I wish I could take it back. You know, but there again, I'm glad it wasn't every day, but the ones that where you have. So the anger doesn't accomplish a whole lot. The wrath of man doesn't work the righteousness of God. Those people who can be cool. And there's all kinds of examples that pop in my mind. I think of good old Jim Lang. He worked for IBM, but he worked for IBM with the services. And he would tell me about some of the officers that would come in and tell him how to run things. And he was the only guy on the ship. And that's the reason they had him on there. He's one of the only 3 guys in the entire company of IBM that was able to wear jeans to work because of all the things he had to do on the ships and everything. But those captains or those or the junior officers were worse, would come in and tell him how to do things. And he would have to sit there and listen. And most guys would just get mad and whatever. He'd sit there and let them tell, and sometimes they would sit there until he did it. And it would fall apart, and then he would fix it the way he wanted to. But he'd learned how to just go with the flow and deal with those cocky people that were over him and not let it affect him. Boy, I learned so much from Jim Lane. He's with the Lord now. But when people come in and they're obnoxious with you as a pastor and they think of you, they're going to tell you how to run the church and everything, just let them talk. And boy, you just so many things you learn from people. And Jim was just one of those great men in the ministry that I'm sure glad that he taught me a lot as a young man in the ministry at the time. But there again, that open rebuke as well as learning from others. Anger is in the bosom of fools. Do not say in your former day. And there again, this is verse 10, is the good old days weren't the best days. When I was I walked to school 5 miles and all this kind of stuff. I don't tell my kids that. I just tell them that I lived on the south shores of Lake Apopka, and I was exactly 1 mile from the school, and I had to walk through orange groves and dodge alligators just to get to high school every day. Now, of course, I never saw an alligator while I was done, but 5 miles to school up to 8, or when I was your age, boy, we just did this. The good old days. We all went through some things, folks. It's the good old days. You look back on them, and there were some real stinking days in those good old days, weren't there? All of us had to go through that. Oh, if back 100 years ago, they had a great time, and boy, they didn't have this problem. Back 100 years ago, they didn't have penicillin. Or 150, 125 years ago. You didn't go to the doctor and get your kid and just have, pop him a pill and take care of an earache. So the good old days weren't the good old days in so many areas. In the good old days, we used to let all of our kids get measles. We'd have measles parties. And I've heard that. Well, that was a good way. Okay, so it might have been better in those. But there again, you ever had measles? Yeah, they're not fun. Or mumps, or all those different things. Those were not the good old days for a lot of people. So The former did. Don't think they're better than these, for you do not inquire wisely concerning this. If you always live I like what like someone said, there's no future in living in the past. Things are not the same today in so many areas. But think about it. We have better comforts today than Solomon had. We have air conditioning, heating, running water, flushing toilets. I mean, all kinds of things that they didn't even think of back then. So we were living in the good old, Solomon would have envied some of our lifestyles. And yet in his day, he was one of the richest men in the world, or the richest man. And so the good old days aren't always the good old days. So he gives you some things to consider. And then he gives you a perspective. Notice now he changes, or how that he says, as he goes through this, wisdom is good inheritance and so forth. But he says, God is control. Let's go back to verse 13 on. Verse 12, he says, wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But he's saying money and mental acumen is not going to bring moral excellence. It's just not going to bring happiness. It's not going to bring excellence in your life. He says, consider the work of God. And this is what he's going to start weaving into his thought life. Now, the rest of the book. Consider God. Now, verse 1 through 5, he rarely mentioned God and just how that he hated life without God. But now he's starting to say, there's certain things you need to learn as I'm giving you this wise counsel from a vain old man. He says, consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? Certain things in life you just can't straighten out. Now, it doesn't mean that there are certain things that are a challenge to us, but certain things you just take as they come. The day of prosperity is joyful, but there's good days and bad days, and you're not going to change that. I can't guarantee you that you're going to live the rest of your life happily ever after. And that's one of the things that kids get disillusioned about, the fairy tale. They get married and they live happily ever after. Well, there's all kinds of challenges in marriage. Now, the only person that lived happily ever after was my wife. She just was thoroughly, every day she woke up and just thanked God for her husband. No, I think someday she probably, never mind. So, no, okay, you did, okay. But there again, I was a stinker in many ways. I had so many things to learn and so forth, but that's the way life is. As one person said, marriage is the institution that God has set up for a man and a woman to learn how to solve problems that they wouldn't have if they remained single. And so, there again, you learn how to deal with problems with each other as well as with the world. And one of the great things about it is learning how to deal with them together. And so, but that's all part of the struggle. So don't think that, that you're going to have all good days. You're not going to, once you get saved, there's still going to be problems. And then he looks at the perspective from that. Notice now in verse 15, I have seen everything in my days of vanity. So let me tell you some of the things that I experienced in my days of walking outside of God's will. In verse 15, he says, in the last part of it, there is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his way. Why is it that some of the best saints that some of the greatest people die young? And some of the worst jerks you've ever met, and the worst sinners you ever met, live into their 90s or 100s. Why is that? And I'm not saying that everybody's like that, but why is it that my father-in-law, one of the godliest men I've ever met, and my mother-in-law, just a tremendous couple, they died comparatively young, both of them in their 60s. And let's see, and yet people that I know that smoke and drank and caroused around, they're still alive and they're 100. Why is that? That doesn't make sense to me. And so but is that always true? No. In fact, I'm glad we got a man here who's going to be one of the stable pillars of our church, Going to be 96 this year, and I don't think of him as the guy that, the wicked guy. But, but he's giving you some general, some of these imponderables. Why does that happen? Why did my father-in-law and my mother, my parent, my in-laws die so young? And they were such a great couple. And yet, other people live forever. And why is it that tremendous young Christian person gets killed in an automobile accident? And that druggy, dope pusher, whatever, lives the rest of, whatever. Why is that? There again, there's certain things that God doesn't tell us why. And so he says, these are things I learned under the sun. Certain people die young, and they shouldn't. That's one of the tragedies of life. And then he says, he goes on from there, and now he gives us, beware of excesses in verse 16 through 18. Do not be overly righteous, nor overly wise. Is he saying don't try to walk uprightly? No, he's not saying that. But he says don't put too much of a show into it. Like I talked about the guy who, I prayed and I had my devotions in the service, but I didn't make a big show of it. And because I didn't have to, just the way I lived differently than other guys, they knew that something was different about me. I didn't have to carry my Bible around or whatever. Now, I did have a little pocket Bible, but I didn't have my big Bible, or whatever. I didn't make a big show of ballet or praying, kneeling at my bedside. If I did, where in our compartments, I'd probably get run over because I'd be in the way of somebody on that ship. So that wasn't, he says, don't be overly righteous, nor overly wise. You don't have to tell people. Have you ever tried to give people wisdom that don't want it? And you know how it feels when you get it and you don't want it. He says, for why should you destroy yourself? Or why set up unneeded enemies? Just by walking with the Lord, and that's what Paul told Timothy, they who walk godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecutions. You don't have to pick them, or you don't have to make yourself a target. And yet there is standards that we have to have. So he's not saying disguise yourself as a Christian, but he says don't overdo it either. So this is that moderation. He says, do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? So if you go out and say, I really believe that God will protect me, and I'm going to walk across this busy highway, and I'm going to prove to everyone that God will protect me. Is God obligated to protect you when you're foolish? Now, many times he has. But if you walk across a busy highway, I don't care how spiritual you are, you better have your eyes open. Right? Or there was another story about the seeing eye dogs, how that a guy proved that their worth by he was blind, and he got out with his new dog and walked across a busy highway. But there again, he was wanting to prove something. But he had a lot of faith in that dog. Verse 18, he says, it is good for you to grasp this and do not remove your hand from another. In other words, stay balanced. The idea of your hands is, keep balanced in life. And so we see, notice how rapid fire he's giving. He says, for who fears God will escape them all. So if you really fear God, then you're going to escape these extremes of life, and you're going to keep yourself from some unwanted battles in life. And then he says, wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. You could have all the councilmen you want, you could have all the power you want, but numbers do not equate with wisdom. The majority doesn't make right. Can all the councilmen and aldermen in our city make a unanimous decision and still be wrong? Yes. We see that all the time, don't we, in government? So mob rule or democracy is not always right. The majority is not always right. He says, but wisdom strengthens the wise. And then as he goes on, of course, in this passage, in verse 19, he says, well, verse 20, he says, and there's what we said, for there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Boy, that's a good one, isn't it? Where do we get that? Romans chapter 3, verse 10. There's none righteous, no, not one. So he gets back to this. We're all imperfect. And so that's just one of the things that I've learned under the sun. I've never met a perfect man. Verse 21, he says, don't let criticism get to you. Do not take to heart everything that people say about you. Be careful of the people who flatter you, because guess what? When you turn your back, even your servant can be saying some bad things about you. But can you take criticism? You know, there are certain people, leaders that I've known, that they try their best to root out anybody who says anything negative about them. You know, every once in a while, but you know, as a leader, you just got to realize there are going to be complainers out there. Now you have to be careful with the rebels and the people that try to lead insurrections or whatever. But he says, sometimes even your servant wants to say some bad things about you. And so, but he says, that's going to be life. He says, for many times also your own heart, he says, consider this, and things I've learned, as I have been very negative toward people, but guess what? People have been very negative toward me, but guess what? I've been negative toward other people. So you got to learn that, yeah, just put yourself in their shoes at times, and maybe their griping might have some substance to it. Then in verse 23, now notice again, all this I have proved by wisdom. So now he says, okay, these are the things I've learned. And notice the one thing that he really sticks out here. Notice in verse 23, he says, all this I proved by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. Wisdom does not come from within. Wisdom, the fear of the Lord is what? The beginning of wisdom. Facing the facts. Common sense is looking at life outside of yourself and realizing that you don't control things, but you control your reaction to things, which makes you wise. But he says, I thought I was going to be wise. And man, what a fool I became. But notice what he says, as for that which is afar off and exceedingly deep, who can find it? How can, there are just certain things I'll never know. And the one thing that I really learned that I never know is verse 25. He says that I applied my heart to know and to search out and seek wisdom and reason of things, to know wickedness and folly, even the folliness of madness. I really went out on the deep end and I just threw fate to the wind and had all kinds of times. But notice what happens, verse 26, and I found more bitter than death. I would have rather died than to have learned this. That the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters, he who pleases God shall escape her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Now, whoa. Now, here he is, a man with 1,000 women. And he says, I met one of them that just ripped my heart out. I've always said, and I've seen this time and time again, and there again, I was an old man. But, the Don Juans, the Solomons who treated women like cattle, they always meet their Delilah. I mean, not always, but in general. I've seen more guys who really played the field and find them, fool them, and leave them alone, like that old Jimmy Dean song or whatever. But they meet that one girl that just rips their heart out. And it's just so interesting to see that, time after time. Now, certain guys are innocent and they get ripped out, but in general, I've seen that time. The one girl that they really are attracted to is the one that can cut them to pieces, and usually does. And boy, the bitter the divorce is, think of some of those Don Juans in Hollywood. What was that one that went on for years? Oh, I don't even remember the names or whatever, but it was for years. The funny guy, the guy with the Caribbean or I never watched any. Jack, what's that? Johnny Depp. I mean, what a mess that was. And yet he was, the leading guy. But boy, she ripped his heart out, didn't she? And so, but there again, all these different things that happen. Very quickly, boy, we got to close. But so he says, the one thing he comes back to is, boy, bitterness comes from this. Then he says, human logic will never solve moral depravity. But he says, in the end, notice how he ends it. He says, truly, there's only have I found, that God made man upright, but they sought out many schemes. So there's a lot of people that God's designed, and he says, if you live right, but man always has his own plans and schemes. And then who is the wise man? And that's the one, the wise man, even his face is different. Okay, we're going to close. Father, thank you again for your word. We pray that you'll bless it to our hearts. Lord, bless those who are watching. We pray, Lord, that just thank you for the ministry you've given us there. But Father, we pray that we would somehow just encourage our hearts with some of the people writing us and letting us know. Thank you again for the blessings of this day. In Jesus' name, amen. Yeah, we need to